Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Heartbeat, your daily Inter Miami podcast. And today we are talking about Robert Taylor getting a contract extension through 2026 with a club option for 2027. It was announced on Friday, but with the buildup to the Leagues Cup, I haven't had an opportunity to address it. And so today felt like the perfect day to talk about one of Inter Miami's greatest ever players getting a contract extension to stay with the club for 2 more seasons. I know that Robert Taylor is not the talent of a Lionel Messi or Luis Suarez, but in terms of what he's done for the club and in terms of his longevity over his career, he's definitely up there as one of the greatest ever players. You know, you could add Drake Callender, maybe Gregory, but ultimately Robert Taylor's as good or as impactful as anyone. And he's going to stay at Inter Miami for another 2 years. The club announced on Friday that he signed a contract through 2026. There's a club option for 2027, and that means Robert Taylor is going to stay in Inter Miami or at Fort Lauderdale for quite some time, at least on the surface, and we'll talk about that. But just to get to the facts, he was set to become free agent at the end of this season. He originally signed a 3-year contract when we signed him from Braun in 2022, and that contract was set to expire at the end of this season. And this is a player that's earned it. Like, I know Inter Miami is going through this incredibly fun period where we're adding global superstars and we're signing all these young South American players and we have all these academy prospects that are blossoming. But Robert Taylor has earned it by being a great player on the field for Inter Miami and a great player for Inter Miami off the field. Since he signed, he's been really, really good for this team. He's on the career goals list in the top 10. He's in the top. He's close to the top for career assists, just behind Lionel Messi. I believe he's second right now. In fact, I should double check that as we are live. But this is a player that came in with very little expectations in terms of being a sort of impact player. And he's gone on to do exactly that, be an impact player. Actually, at present, he sits atop the career assist mark for Inter Miami players with 17. That record, I believe, was just broken on Saturday night. Lionel Messi has 16, Robert Taylor with 17. And so this is a player that has a spot in Inter Miami history, no doubt about it. Anyways, when we signed him in 2022 from Braun, this was not a player that Inter Miami expected to be a huge impact player. We were consistently looking for wing play back then. He did establish himself as a starter that season, but it never felt like he was a locked-in starter. He ended up starting 30 of 37 games he played that season, but we brought in Coco Jean in the middle of the season, and we had Indiana Vasilev, and Emerson Rodriguez felt like he was, they were trying to get him to blossom into a starter. So it never felt like Robert Taylor was the guy on left wing. And some of those starts were in other parts of the field as a wing back, as a fullback even. He's a flexible player who can play multiple different positions. And so he never felt like a locked-in starter. And he ended up finishing that season with 3 goals and 4 assists. And listen, Phil Neville and Chris Henderson didn't see him as a locked-in starter heading into 2023. They went out and signed Nico Stefanelli. They expected to get Coco Jean back from that injury that he had right after he arrived. Rodolfo Pizarro came back from Monterrey. And so Robert Taylor was sort of an afterthought heading into the beginning of last season, a depth piece who was being paid to be a depth piece. And ultimately, that's how he started the season. And, he had that incredible goal against Philadelphia in the second game of the season to kick off the campaign. But he was definitely not a starter. We saw Stefanelli. We saw Pizarro. We saw Coco Jean. We saw a number of guys get opportunities to start ahead of Robert Taylor. And it wasn't really until the second half of last season, long after Phil Neville got fired, that Robert Taylor started to become a locked-in starter for this team. And, of course, he had that incredible Leagues Cup run where he scored 4 goals, had 3 assists in 7 games, and that was incredibly memorable. And we'll never, as Inter Miami fans, forget what he did in that tournament. But that was when he really established himself as the guy. And again, even thinking back to last summer, we signed Facundo Farias not to be the right winger, but probably to be the left winger and to put Robert Taylor on the bench. And so the fact that he kept his spot just shows how much of a breakout it was, and also, in a sense, how unexpected it was from Tata Martino and from Chris Henderson. He ends up finishing last year with 26 starts in 40 games played, 8 goals, 9 assists, an incredible season, really, from Robert Taylor, 17 goal contributions. But then he didn't get the contract extension. At the very end of last season, Leo Campana got a contract extension, Kamal Miller got a contract extension, Gregory got a contract extension. And despite playing really well down the stretch, Robert Taylor didn't get a contract extension this offseason. And it was something I was looking at as definitely on the table for Robert Taylor. And it never really materialized. It never looked like Inter Miami was that interested in signing him to an extension. Those talks didn't feel like they ever really got going. And so he came into this season in the final year of his contract, and he came in as a starter. People remembered what he did last year, but I think despite what he did in the second half of last season, there was a you still got to prove it mentality around Robert Taylor. Facundo Farias gets injured in the first game of the preseason, out for the season. And so Robert Taylor comes in as the starter, but Inter Miami was very low on depth in the wing positions. And they were always looking to add a new player. And they did that eventually with Matias Rojas. Taylor sort of beat off Matias Rojas for that left wing spot. We have seen Diego Gómez take it from Robert Taylor a couple times this season, but ultimately Robert Taylor has locked in his spot on that left wing. And if you're putting out your best 11 for Inter Miami, I think you have Robert Taylor on that left wing, and I think Tata Martino has Robert Taylor on that left wing. And so congratulations to him. He's clearly won over Tata Martino compared to this time a year ago. And he's one of the few players on Inter Miami from the pre-Tata era to actually win over Tata Martino, right? We think about the guys that we signed, and a lot of players that Inter Miami fans really liked that have never seemingly been able to win over Tata Martino, and a lot of them have since left the club. DeAndre Yedlin and Kamal Miller and Gregory. None of them were able to get an imprint on Tata Martino that they belong on this team, but Robert Taylor has. Just worth mentioning, he did forego national team duty this year, earlier this season, to stay with Inter Miami for some league games that he could have easily missed and no one would have blamed him. And instead, he stays. And I think that showed just how much Robert Taylor wanted to be at Inter Miami, how much he wanted to sacrifice for the team. And that was certainly regarded and noticed by the fans. As far as the fan reaction, when this came out on Friday, you may have noticed, at least I noticed, a lot of fans saying, okay, well, it was fun having Robert Taylor, but ultimately this means he's going to be traded soon. And I wanted to talk about that for a few minutes because Inter Miami does have a history of trading players right after signing them to contract extensions. And so when you see Robert Taylor get a contract extension, you kind of think to yourself, maybe this means they're about to sell him. And I think this goes back to last March when we signed Bryce Duke to a contract extension. He was an exciting player in 2022, certainly not consistent, certainly not impactful in the majority of games, but a young player that Inter Miami felt like they could groom into a really good player. And he had his moments in 2022, and they signed him to that contract extension to make him a part of the team long-term on March 16th of 2023. And they ended up trading him less than 30 days later on April 12th, less than 4 weeks later, to Montreal in the Kamal Miller trade. I think this one was particularly sinister because the reason Bryce Duke, let me put it this way. It was a good decision at the time of the trade by Inter Miami, but the reason Bryce Duke had so much value compared to Kamal Miller, who Kamal Miller's the better player, is because Bryce Duke had a long-term contract and Kamal Miller was set to become a free agent at the end of the season. And so it gave the vibe or the sense that Bryce Duke signed a contract extension to make him a more valuable long-term player, and that Inter Miami immediately cashed in on that value without concern for the interests of Bryce Duke. And listen, this is something that happens in the MLS, right? There is the ability to trade between clubs. Players don't have to sign new contracts with the new clubs like you would find in most countries in the world in FIFA. This is much more of an American model where players can be traded sort of without their consent across the league. And that does happen all the time. Anyways, so Bryce Duke, they sign and then they trade a month later. Kamal Miller, a guy they signed to a contract extension on October 3rd, traded him on December 30th, less than 3 months later. This was another player that clearly wasn't traded of his own volition. Kamal Miller, one of the reasons we were able to acquire him for a relatively cheap price is because he had said to Montreal, I'm not signing a contract extension. I plan on going to Europe after this current season. And by signing a contract extension with Inter Miami, he prevented himself from looking at opportunities in Europe last winter. And then, of course, he was traded to Portland. And so you can understand why Kamal Miller might say, hey, listen, I want to be part of this special project going on at Inter Miami because we have Messi and Suarez and we were signing Julian Gressel and Busquets and Alba. But you can also see him thinking, I'd rather test the waters in Europe before signing an extension with Portland because ultimately he forgoes that opportunity to go to Europe and probably forever, right? He's 26, 27 now. And so he's probably not going to get that opportunity to go to Europe. And part of the reason is because Inter Miami convinced him to sign this contract extension and then ultimately traded him a few months later. And then another player, Gregory, we signed to a contract extension last October 16th, and we ended up selling him on February 19th to become roster compliant. This one I think is a little less sinister because I think Inter Miami signed that contract extension with Gregory to try and make it possible for them to keep him. And Gregory certainly wanted to be a part of this team. But as the offseason unfolded, it kind of became clear that they were not going to be able to keep Gregory. And eventually Gregory agrees to the move to go back to Brazil, and it works out for everyone, but particularly the Bryce Duke and Kamal Miller deals where they didn't have a choice. And it did feel like by signing the extension, Inter Miami made them a much more valuable trade piece, only to trade them soon after was a little disheartening if you're just a fan of athletes in general. And it could feel the same way about Robert Taylor. Now, Robert Taylor, of course, is leaving or was set to leave Inter Miami at the end of this season. And now he's got a contract extension. This is a player the fans love. He just crossed the 100 appearance mark now at 101 appearances. He's tied. Actually, he owns the record solely over Drake Callender for the 101 appearance mark. This is a player that the Inter Miami fans love. He's been very successful. He's been instrumental when they've done their best, right? When they won the Leagues Cup last year, he was phenomenal. And I think he's going to have to be great this year if they want to win trophies again. So Inter Miami fans love this player. And I think the hesitation to be incredibly excited about the contract extension has more to do with the Inter Miami's history than it does with the excitement about having this player long-term. So what does this mean for 2024? I did just mention that Robert Taylor now feels like a more valuable trade piece than he did a week ago, because if you were a team looking to trade for him and you were only going to get him for the last 10 MLS games, 9 MLS games, you might not be willing to part with quite as much as if you knew you had him for the next 2 or 3 seasons, 2.5, 3.5 seasons. That said, and I think Robert Taylor was certainly a trade candidate if this didn't happen. But that said, I think because of this, Inter Miami is not going to trade Robert Taylor this season. I think this locks Robert Taylor in for the rest of 2024, something that clearly Robert Taylor wants. And Inter Miami and Tata Martino, I think, feel the same way. And so for 2024, it means we're probably keeping Robert Taylor throughout the season. And it also means for Robert Taylor's own sanity, he won't have to worry about the potential of being traded any day. I think for him, that'll be really good peace of mind for him and his family to not have to think any day could be their last day in Fort Lauderdale. So from those perspectives, I do think it's a really big positive for 2024. But ultimately, he was under contract for this season and clearly in the plans of Tata Martino for the rest of the season. So I don't think it changes a lot about 2024. But for 2025 and beyond, it does change some things. Chris Henderson and Tata Martino have done an incredible job of building roster flexibility into this roster. And so when you look down at the list of players on this roster, almost all of them are able to move by either at the end of this season or at the end of 2025. Almost nobody is signed to a contract beyond 2025. The only exception to that really is Julian Gressel and now Robert Taylor as veterans that are signed beyond 2025, which is, of course, the end of the Lionel Messi contract with Inter Miami. So if Messi leaves in 2025, Inter Miami will have the option to hit a full reset and kind of reshape their roster in a significant way. By giving this contract to Taylor, Taylor now cements himself as a player that's going to be on the team long-term. Same with Julian Gressel. There are a few other players that have contracts beyond that, but they're all young players that would be easy to move if Inter Miami wanted to. Guys like Leo Campana, Federico Redondo, Toto Aviles, Facundo Farias, the young players that would be easy to move on if Inter Miami wanted to. The only two veterans that are locked in beyond 2025, Julian Gressel, Robert Taylor. So you have taken away some of your flexibility, and I'm not certain that Robert Taylor is going to survive at Inter Miami beyond this season. By agreeing to this contract extension, Robert Taylor now under contract, but again, Inter Miami can move him still if they want to. And I think there will be interest from around the league. And then ultimately, we don't know what the financial side of this contract looks like yet. He was one of the cheapest or one of the best contracts in terms of value to price in the entire league. And now we don't know what he's going to be making. If he got a 3 times, his extension is worth 3 times as much per year, it could be a little bit more of a problem, especially when we talk about roster flexibility. And so for Inter Miami, they re-sign Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor clearly gets the thing he wants, and that's to stay at Inter Miami. But for Inter Miami, they have a history of selling players after signing them to extensions and trying to get more value out of them. And so hopefully for Inter Miami fans, that's not the case with Robert Taylor. There's 2 other things I wanted to talk about today. The first is the Olympics. The second match day of the Olympic soccer tournament, men's soccer tournament, was on Saturday. Our 2 players, Benjamin Kramaski and Diego Gómez, were both playing in that game. And as you may remember, on the first match day, both teams lost. And so they were sort of on the verge of elimination, but both teams had big wins on Saturday. Benjamin Kramaski made his debut in a 4-1 victory over New Zealand for the U.S. Olympic team. And so now heading into the last match day, the U.S. has a solid to good chance of getting through to the knockout stages. Basically, they play Guinea. And so here's the scenario. New Zealand plays France. If New Zealand loses to France, the USA is almost guaranteed to go through. It would have to be a huge upset from Guinea to upset the USA for them to not go through. If New Zealand draws France, then the USA is through with a draw. And then if New Zealand beats France, the USA would need to win and maintain the goal difference advantage. So it's possible that they don't go through, but right now they do look like the favorites to go through. And then for Paraguay, who beat Israel 4-2, Diego Gómez had a couple of assists in that game. They play Mali. If they beat Mali, they're through. If they draw Mali, and if Israel lose to Japan, they're through. But if they lose to Mali, they're eliminated. So another big game. Paraguay controls their own destiny, and ultimately it's just up to them to go get a win against Mali, who drew against Israel and then lost to Japan. So Mali, desperate for a win. Paraguay, desperate for a win. Both teams, the USA and Paraguay, have an excellent chance to make it to the knockout stages of that tournament. And so that would prolong their return. The final match day of the Olympics, the match day 3, is on Wednesday. So we will find out about both of those teams in the next couple days. And then the last thing I want to talk about was Diego Gómez, who continually inches closer to Brighton. Fabrizio Romano, noted transfer journalist in Europe, did tweet out this morning that Inter Miami and Brighton had agreed to a fee in excess of £10 million for Diego Gómez. He didn't clarify whether Gómez would stay at Inter Miami until the winter. So I think that question is leaning towards Gómez staying, but ultimately hasn't been answered yet. If that story develops more, I will talk about it more on the episode tomorrow. But I just wanted to give an update because we've talked about Diego Gómez plenty of times and Brighton plenty of times on this podcast. So that's the update, and that's it for today. Guys, as always, I will see you tomorrow. I hope you have a wonderful day.